even more than this thrusting into hunger is the breakdown of trust. And when he tells us to bang utensils on our balconies, he obviously was talking to only people who had houses with balconies. There's no one for us. That is what the labouring poor and the destitute poor have learned. This should have shaken us to our core. Most people, their lives just don't matter. The problem is us. We chose these governments. Most people feel that what we are suffering is primarily because we've been hit by this virus which has brought the entire world on its knees. And the government is doing what best it could. And that is absolutely untrue. I, with my young colleagues, was on the streets from the second, third day, and we were distributing food. I was expecting that I would catch COVID very early. And it was something that I just said will happen, it has to happen. So I took some precautions. My father was 95. I said, I'm going to stop. I explained to him, I'm going to stop seeing you. And every evening we would have this long video call instead. My mother-in-law stays with us. She's 85. I said, I'm not going to enter into your room. My wife and I started sleeping in separate bedrooms. We kept whatever, and I said, I don't want to be the source of the infection. But I didn't get COVID. I spent 4 hours one morning in the COVID clinic, and we found that the positivity rates were 15%, 20%. Then, which was frightening, which means high community transmission has started among the poor. Next thing, I got COVID, my whole family got COVID, my other colleague got COVID. My wife had a little fever. My mother-in-law, about whom we were very worried, actually was the healthiest of everybody. And nothing. Actually, I have a congenital heart problem. I was born, I was a 7-month baby, and the valve in my heart was defective, etc. So it was foolish of me, retrospectively, but I was anxious that I should not create problems for my family. So again, I made a retrospectively probably foolish condition that I won't go into a private ward, a private room. I'll go into the general ward. So I went in, and that general ward of a premier medical center is as close to hell that I can imagine. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating. So we went in, there were 50 people. Nobody even, gave me a change of clothes. So whatever clothes I was wearing, I lay down in them. At home, people were checking my oxygen levels, this, that. Nobody even talked to me. No one did anything like that. There was noise levels at this pitch. The nurses were screaming. And the lot of ward boys, they were screaming even 2 o'clock at night, 3 o'clock at night. Then you had these monitors. Like I also had a monitor, but the monitor was not functioning, but it was screaming. So that was also screaming, and it was just going on. Nobody would allow you to even go to the toilet. You had to keep begging people that I'm desperate. Because I like to do that, I started speaking to the ward boys, and I discovered that most of them were completely untrained. So this boy tells me that I used to work in a hotel in Connaught Place. The hotel has closed down. I needed a job. The trained health personnel, including of the Premier Institute, have refused to work for the COVID patients. So they advertise for anyone who's so desperate to protect their families, who's willing to work in a COVID ward, has just been brought in here. They had this long lockdown. They hadn't done any training of them. So you had these untrained boys, and you had these 4 or 5 very hardworking but very loud-pitched nurses, and there was total chaos. There was pandemonium. Then after a day or two, I said, I just begged them. I said, I need to have a bath at least. I just can't just lie in these same clothes. Can I have a bath? So very reluctantly they let me go. And after that, I've lost memory of what happened. For 10 days, I have complete amnesia. But what my family tells me that I used to answer the phone. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped this thing. So my wife got very anxious, said, what's happened? They said, he's gone into a depression. So she said that it's not in his nature, but even if he has, you don't switch on and off. That he was talking at great length to me half an hour ago, and now you're saying he's not even speaking a word. it doesn't work that way. Something must have happened. No, he's in a depression. I come home, apparently I didn't speak, I didn't eat. I had this continuous, very splitting headache. And but they'd been told there's nothing wrong with me. Then about 4 or 5 days more passed, and then I started developing those blue marks here. So they finally took me to a more modest private hospital, which they knew I was in no position to say anything, but I would have objected less. They were good and they looked at me, but they said, COVID ka to koi problem hi nahi hai, but he has a very serious head injury. I mean, in that situation, my wife found a modest hospital. So everything that I described in the first public hospital was sort of double magnified over here. And it was just unbearable, actually. And then my memory slowly started coming back. And I realized now that I was hallucinating. And my hallucination was, I suppose, a little sort of immodest, but that I'd got okay with COVID finally. And people who loved me were very happy. And in order to celebrate that, so I work with a lot of vulnerable population, but I was among the detention center, people who's released from the detention center. I'd fought with Justice Ranjan Gogoi and we had a lot of this thing, and they finally 300, 400 have been released. So out of all of the people, apparently I found myself, I was in Assam among them, and we were all very happy. Then after about 4 or 5 days, I finally got out of that. And I came home and I lay down in bed, and the next morning my father passed away. And because he realized, because through everything else I would be speaking, 10 days I had not spoken to, I wasn't there. And he realized that, and he just gave up. Even now when the doctors look at the MRI, they look at it and they look at me and they virtually are saying, but how are you even alive? And I would have been just one more COVID death, if they had their way. And their way of actually not caring and not doing anything about it. And this has happened to me with all the social capital that I have, the friends, the education, the goodwill. This is what I experienced. What would ordinary Indians be doing? And so therefore when we say this is a time when this is the X-ray that shows up, that that most people, their lives just don't matter. Firstly, did we need a lockdown? Was the lockdown what we should have done? And should it have been as severe, as extensive and as long? Our Prime Minister, whose whole politics is based on the fact that he comes from very humble origins. And I've said this before, but I think the first speech he gave, he basically said that you have to do 4 things because we have to deal with this crisis. The first of them is that you stay at home and work from home. Second is keep social distance. And third is, this radical hygiene, keep washing your hands, etc. Now, while he was speaking, I was saying that he's our Prime Minister. Has he forgotten that there are large numbers of people, firstly, who don't even have homes? Where will they stay during this period? How will they lock themselves down? There's an even massive proportion of people living in most of our cities, a place like in Bombay, etc., the densest populations in the world, and the people living in and if 10 people are sharing, say, a small one-room tenement half the size of my this small office room, and 150 people share one toilet, how are they ever going to social distance? The Prime Minister didn't seem to be concerned about that. He said everyone should keep washing their hands. Does he not know you just have to go out every morning and see outside slums? People are desperate. You buy, and I've asked them the prices. Sometimes it is 10 rupees, 20 rupees to get these 2 or 3 pots of water with which they have to cook, they have to bathe, you're asking them to keep washing their hands when you have no running water. And when he tells us to bang utensils on our balconies, he obviously was talking to only people who had houses with balconies. Now scientists tell us that when there were just 500 people, 500 recorded infections, and you suddenly had locked down the entire country. If instead people had been assisted to go to their homes, there would have been hardly any infection in the rural areas. Instead, what did we do? We forced them to stay here in these extremely crowded settlements. And this is a virus that loves closely packed bodies. And we saw with our homeless people, they were packed into schools where people were. So everybody was just packed together. And so we actually used the lockdown to create a series of hothouses for super spreading of the illness. And then finally when people desperately started walking and they went home and all of that, there were tens and thousands and lakhs of cases among them, which they then took back to their villages when they could have gone without it at all. So the fact that you did this very cruel, the most harshest lockdown in the world, the biggest lockdown in the world with the smallest relief package, thrust millions of our people, literally millions of our people, into mass hunger. There's a place called Yamuna Pushta where about 4,000 homeless people have been living for years. And they said they were much safer there because they were sleeping in the open and so on. They said, no, we're going to put them into so-called quarantine centers. They were packing them into school buildings where hundreds of them sharing same toilets, etc. And some of them, I met about 20, 30 of them, and some of them just went into the trees and stayed there 24 hours, 48 hours, hiding, somehow kept away. Now, one of the people I spoke to told me that before they went in, they would check their fever. Now, this guy unfortunately had fever. So they took him into a COVID ward. And they said that it takes 4 days, so you have to be here. He said that they took them to the hospital, but they put them into a ward where people are already infected with COVID. Then they said that none of the nurses, none of the ward boys, doctors ka to sawal hi nahi hai, did anything for the patients. They wouldn't go near them, they wouldn't touch them. People were dying and there were corpses all around. And here he was lying amidst corpses with no one to take care of him. And he was absolutely terrified. When in the 4th day the result came, fortunately it turned out to be negative. In the dead of the night, he just slipped out and began walking. And he walked 20, 30 kilometers. And he reached his place of safety, which was, the banks of the Yamuna. And they were living inside these hume pipes. They said it was safe because from the road, the police were not able to deal with them. So the only way they could protect themselves, they were probably the safest, was by staying away from the state, because the state was just doing this devastation. I think perhaps a mirage of expectation that somewhere the state will protect me, somewhere my employers will protect me in some way. They won't let me, they won't just throw me entirely and my children into the wolves of hunger. But that's precisely what we did. The employers abandoned them. And many of them were so small and they didn't even have the opportunity. And the state completely abandoned them. Even more than this thrusting into hunger is the breakdown of trust. There's no one for us. That is what the labouring poor and the destitute poor have learnt. The only rationale, if at all, for a lockdown of this scale, with all of these costs, was that we would prepare and build our health infrastructure to deal with the surge of cases that would come once the lockdown closes down. They did virtually nothing of it. They talked about so many hundreds and thousands of beds, etc. They were not new beds. They were repurposed beds. And basically what happened is that for this period, we don't care if you have cancer, we don't care if you're a cardiac patient, we don't care if you have virtually any other ailment. In Mumbai, they actually took patients out from a psychiatric ward and some other, a cancer ward it was, and they put them on mats under a bridge in order to create COVID beds. 80% of our trained health force, doctors and so on, work for the private sector, 80%. The contribution of the private sector to helping people in this time of crisis has been estimated at not more than 10%. I believe that when the history of our times is written, the history of humankind is written, we will be seen as among one of the most cruel periods in human history, the total breakdown of solidarity. I've been talking about the government as if the problem was out there, and I really realized that it is much more here with us in the middle class and the rich. The migrants finally, when they had nothing at all, they began to walk. And please remember, this is the biggest movement. It's the biggest movement, distress movement of populations in human history, except for the slaves being taken from Africa. I mean, that I've calculated was larger, but it was even bigger than partition. This should have shaken us to our core. People were stunned at seeing the number of migrant workers. How are you so stunned? Yeah? Your entire life, from the moment before you open your eyes, the person who delivers your milk, your newspapers, the person who is taking care of your children, cooks the food, drives you to work, etc., etc., is all this same migrant population. 9 out of 10 workers have no protection of any kind. Now, one would have thought that at least now what the government should have done was to say that we'll have more comprehensive, labor protection, labor rights, etc. What they have instead chosen to do is to dismantle even the few labor protection that existed. So if we go away from this discussion thinking that our problem was the government, I think we're completely missing the point. The problem is us. We chose these governments. We've chosen a prime minister who chose at the peak of the hunger to be photographed wearing, expensive clothes, feeding peacocks in his garden. The symbolism of it is something. And we applaud this leadership. We've chosen them. Is this the society, is this the country, is this the world that we want to leave to our children? I think that is something that we have to